I'm Homi Bhabha. I direct the Mahindra Humanities Center, and I want to welcome you to a remarkable occasion this afternoon. Trans Arts is the Mahindra Humanities Center first event that specifically addresses and celebrates the culture of the trans. In keeping with the spirit of the humanities, the aim of our programming is to help build communities and support them as best we can in the conversations that come alive in various parts of this campus. When I read my colleague Stephen Burt's diary in the London Review of Books, I felt very strongly that the transgender and genderqueer communities had not been directly addressed by our programming, and we were all the poorer for it. It was the detail of his description of what it took to dress up, of what it meant to see yourself in another gender role, of how imprisoning it was to live within norms that, while claiming to be natural or neutral, were in fact ill-fitting impositions. I remember writing to Stephanie Burt the very next morning and inviting him to help us organize this event, which she has done so successfully. Thank you, Stephen. Congratulations. Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you.
Transgender occupies an extremely important political and cultural territory in contemporary society. Trans trumps the tyranny of identity. It unsettles the concept of selfhood as necessarily singular and synchronous with itself. It disturbs gender norms grounded in polarities and encourages us to explore interstitial, in-between states of being and feeling. Transgender embodies the creativity of self-expression and self-presentation that emerges from what may seem asymmetric, ambivalent, or even contradictory, and yet makes a claim to the rights of representation without permission or exception. Indeed, the transformative nature of the trans resonates with the courage of innovation as we know it and admire it. As much as we celebrate the culture of the trans, there is no getting away from the harsher realities of minoritization and prejudice with which it has to contend. Gender lives on the cusp of power and powerlessness, at the limits of toleration and tyranny, on the frontiers of affiliation and antagonism, at the limits of love and rejection. And as such, the trans arts are as much about justice as they are about joy. I feel sure that this event will bring the campus together in ways in which it has not been convened before, and I very much hope the Mahindra Humanities Center will continue to participate and play a role in this very important project. For us at the center, it is a privilege to be able to host all of you, and it is our firm wish that you will continue to be our guests in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It is an honor to take part of this. Thanks to Homi Bhabha, thanks to Sarah Razor and to Steve Beal, who helped put this together. You should all have, and if not, Sarah and Martin and others have for you programs that give the really remarkable and varied accomplishments of our panelists. So I'm not going to give detailed introduction now. I will simply point to our brilliant and accomplished graduate student, Michael Weinstein, the poet, critic, and editor who has come here from several people have come here from New York, who's come here from New York, Trace Peterson, whose work often appears as Tim Trace Peterson. They're all the same person. Donna Perry, the writer and video artist and DJ, and Donna does other things as well. I'm Stephanie. I'm also Stephen. Michael Bronski, the historian and journalist and professor of your title is Professor of the Practice in Women's and Gender Studies?
In Media and Activism.
In Media and Activism, and the poet, critic, and third-year English undergraduate Kat Baus. And we are going to have an open-ended conversation with Q's and A's and Q's that follow the A's and A's that follow the Q's, and we'll have some images, and we will certainly have some time for audience cues as we move on. We're going to stop no later than 6:30, and we are going to reconvene around 7:30. We will see part of the film Project Loose, the video art. And we will then have, as the night's marquee performer and performance, Kate Bornstein, who's also come here from New York. And I should also mention Kate's many books. Some of them are noted here. The latest still is the memoir, A Queer in Pleasant Danger, which I recommend without reservation. We should take a minute before we start our conversation. First to have, can you hear me? Yeah. First to see that the video, there we go. To note that the very significant critic and queer theory writer, Jose Muñoz at New York University, passed away at some point within the last 24 hours. We have not, this is news to me, and it's sad news. As some of you know, this is someone whose work has turned out to be quite important and inspiring in creating the fields we now think of as queer studies and queer theory inside and outside the academy. And I regret not having met him myself, but it's clear that if you're here, you would want to see some of the things that he wrote, and it's sad that he's not going to be able to see what we do with some of the ideas that he helped put into play. So just a moment of not just sadness that he's not around anymore, but remembering to go read the books and the articles and the essays that he wrote. Okay, thanks. So I'm going to ask some questions, and we're going to have some answers, and we're going to have a number of works of art that will come into play. There are many opportunities around the country. Things have changed so much so fast to look at the social composition and the politics of the different trans communities and the way that trans communities speak to one another and to larger GLBTQ and sometimes I, as we say, life and work. But today is first about works of art and the ways in which works of art reflect the spectrum of trans and genderqueer identities that are out there. And the first question I want to ask everybody is about the difference between people and works of art. It's clear that there are people who identify as the different flavors of trans. Oh. That goes out whenever there's not someone standing at the lectern, is that right? Wow. It's like an electric metaphor for coming out. If you stand up, it lights up. If you don't, you're not visible. Thank you. Yeah. So there are clearly people who are various kinds and flavors of trans and genderqueer, but is that really a kind that we can apply to works of art? Is there a thing called trans art, or is that just the same as art made by people who self-identify? Let's start with Michael.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm not sure. From my position, I would say I don't think that the categories transgender or genderqueer necessarily exist outside of sort of the real world identity categories that we're talking about. So art isn't inherently trans or genderqueer, but it might deal with some of the implications of those experiences. So that's, I guess, it could be a result of the author's identification with those categories or a function of the art trying to address that experience.
Mm-hmm. So a topic and a point of view, but not necessarily a kind.
I think it has to do with works of art that position themselves that way. So I would like to think that even if I identify as trans or genderqueer, I don't necessarily only write trans or genderqueer poetry, for example.
Yeah. Trace. Trace is here in part as the editor of an anthology to which this question is central. And should we hold up the anthology? I can hold it up while you're speaking.
Hi, everybody. I'm really honored to be here, excited to be here. Okay, I have two positions on this because, on the one hand, I was the editor of this anthology, Troubling the Line, Trans and Genderqueer Poetry and Poetics, and the co-editor with T.C. Tolbert, we collaborated on this book. Our prompt for this book was to put together an open call for people who identified as trans or genderqueer. And this is a bit of an unusual formulation, trans and genderqueer, trans or genderqueer. Part of what we were trying to do with this anthology is to make it a bridge between different parts of the trans community, which may not see themselves as like each other, or which may clash in some ways. So we wanted sort of a big umbrella, a big tent, and that was sort of the principle of selection, or the principle of self-selection was that people self-identify as trans or as genderqueer for this anthology. And we gave them an opportunity in these poetic statements to talk about the ways in which they did and how it connected to their work. And the answer turned out to be different in each case. Some people said they write trans poetry, and here is how their poetics connects to their body and their experience as a trans person. And some people didn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. They wanted to have a theory of poetics that could be universal for everyone beyond them. So I think it's a complicated issue. Yeah.
Hannah, do you want to speak to the same question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. To answer this question, I think that we have to look at what the medium is, the medium of choice, the intention of the artist itself. And I would agree with Tim Trace that I think that these are all individual cases, and people will, invest in their artwork what they feel, whatever the meaning they want to inject into it. So I think that it's, really difficult to answer that question. In my own work, I like to be kind of an invisible object and subject. So I tend to hide in the margins in my own work, and I insert myself where I'd like to be, but I don't know if that necessarily makes it trans unless I want it to be, or if it's just a separate piece of work. It's really, I think, up to the individual, up to the medium that you're using, and I think that can make a big difference.
Says we're not going to have everybody answer every question, but this one I do want to get everyone's take. Michael.
Sure. I think I've sort of forgotten exactly what the question was, but I have two answers. And the first is that, I think it's interesting to really focus on works of art and what the artist might bring to it, and how that helps describe it as well, and what the intentionality is for the artist in the work. But I think it's also possible, I think this is sort of a spin upon the question, I think it's also interesting to think of actually everybody's life, particularly perhaps, or maybe not, trans people's lives as actually works of art in themselves.
Lives as works of art.
Lives of works, yeah, lives.
I got a follow-up question for you.
Certainly Christine Jorgensen, the great, we now say transgender, but transsexual celebrity of the 1950s and 60s, created herself as a work of art.
Yeah. We can call her transsexual. That's the kind of, as we now say, that's the kind of transgender that she was.
Yeah, although it's interesting because actually, if you read the autobiography, Jorgensen actually uses the word transgender back in 1964, I believe, meaning transsexual, actually. But the other thing that I was thinking about was that, are there works that are actually, and I'm thinking of using trans as transformative, even though they may have trans characters. And when you were mentioning it, I was thinking of a great trans play, right, from 1900, Peter Pan by James M. Barrie. in which he stipulates that Peter Pan is actually played by a woman, usually in her 40s, playing a 13-year-old boy. But it's a really subversive work. It's a work that really transes in many ways. It transgresses. It actually looks at childhood sexuality. It actually looks at childhood autonomy, childhood submission. And I think for anybody having grown up, I was born in 1949, and growing up in the 50s, we watched Peter Pan with Mary Martin every year on TV. And it really, for all those children, it really was this amazing, amazing performance, spectacle to see Mary Martin, a 45-year-old woman playing a 13-year-old boy, and what that meant for actually understanding gender. So I do think there are ways in which works of art can be called transgender, even though James and Barry would never call it that.
Yeah, well, because the term was not available to Jan Barry.
Right. And he was following a fairly typical theatrical convention, which is that women would play young men.
Yeah, we're going to get back to theatrical convention in a minute. I want Kat's response to the initial question about is there a thing called trans art, or is there a kind that you or people you know or people you're reading work in that seems trans-identified as a kind of art?
Yeah, I'm hesitant to say that yes, definitively, I think that there is a trans kind of art. I'm sure that there is something out there that I would call it, but if there is, I haven't quite found it yet. I think that, I definitely agree the sort of topic of a poem or a novel or a piece of artwork being the same as its category, that they don't quite line up, but I think sort of working with the contrast between those two things, a poem about transgressive, transgender, trans-star topics set into a traditional form, or a transgressive form used to talk about typicalized gender norms might be able to work within that.
A tension between some kind of existing norm, in other words, art that has some kind of existing norm to push back against or to try to alter. That makes sense. I'm going to do this tennis style, so the next question is going to go to Kat first. But it comes out of what everyone was saying, I think, because it has to do with media, not specific genres, the sestina, the five-act comedy, and so on, but media. Dahana, you were talking about keeping yourself out of your work, which makes more sense when I think about film and video than if I think about, for example, as a singer. And Michael, you're talking about memoir, which we'll get back to, and Kat, you have some theater experience, and Michael, you're talking about something that only works fully in live theater. Mm-hmm. I wonder, and this speaks to Kate's performance later tonight, I wonder whether there's something special about the conditions of live theater, whether there's something about metaphors drawn from the stage, from live theater, that helps us think in particular about trans experience, about having more than one gender or a changing gender or an unstable gender. Some of you are thinking of Judith Butler and some are not. Let's try to have at least one answer that refers to her ideas and at least one that does not. Theater.
I'm going to go for the latter category. I'm actually meeting with the Harvard Radcliffe's Dramatic Club board next week to discuss, with luck, directing my first show in the spring, which is Dog Sees God by Burt V. Royal. It's a parody of the Peanuts comic strip. But, it doesn't talk about gender very explicitly. There's misogyny that happens. There's a lot of sexual objectification along gender lines. But one of the things that I'm really interested in is seeing, what does happen in a space like that when you have these sort of discourses that exist in the gender binary. You have, say, a very stereotypical jock guy saying all of these terribly objectifying things about women, but having, in the space of live theater, those words come from the mouth of someone that an audience can see as female-bodied when, the other characters or the people in the world of the play would not. I don't know what I think that's going to do yet, but I think that knowing where discourses come from or putting words in different people's mouths is an interesting way of exploring that. Does that answer that question?
Yes, it does. And it seems, I'm hoping that, I don't know, I like change and execute, the sentence to do. Change and enter. I want our power on, though. Our power is on. It would be great to get a few more names of works. I like that idea that what you're seeing in live theater is a body and a discourse that doesn't match the physical body. And maybe even costume and sound and light that don't match the physical body. And I think of Peter Pan, aren't there some, Peter Pan off in Tinkerbell is not a cast character, right? There's a light?
No, there's a light.
Yeah.
Only in the Disney cartoon did she become a parody of Marilyn Monroe in that perverse 1950s Disney approach. But I think what's interesting, and we can go back to Shakespeare clearly. Yeah. But clearly, I mean, what theater does, and I think only, but maybe not only, but what theater does spectacularly is that it forces us with the suspension of disbelief. So we can actually see it. You know, I'm just thinking now on Broadway, like Mark Rylance is doing Twelfth Night and Richard, and with an all-male cast, just like Shakespeare did, right? So that, I mean, we are literally faced with the possibility of actually engaging, fully knowing what we're doing, fully engaging, because we know that people don't fly on stage. We know that boys can play women, or that people don't really die when they're killed at the end of Hamlet, right?
Yeah.
So we do have, and you know, when we think of, I'll mention the Judith Butler name. You know, when we do think about performance, you know, that there is something very special about theater that I think lends itself, and has always historically lent itself to a trans presentation, and maybe even a trans experience. When we look at an actor or actress, Charlotte Shark, who's a famous just around Shakespeare's time, who actually ran theater. She performed. She was the daughter of Colley Cibber, the much ridiculed poet laureate.
Made fun of poet laureate.
Yeah. The Dunce. Yeah. You know, I think that's a really important thing, right? To think about what theater does that's actually just very special, right, to theater, in something that movies, video performance, singing just doesn't do.
Yeah. It's as if there were, in the experience of live theater, buttons that could be pushed to activate or to execute.
Yeah.
The potential for thinking about trans embodiment, about bodies and gender roles and gender performances that don't match one another, and that have to be brought into alignment by changing one or the other, by performative work, by artwork. Theater, you can also talk about other live performances, Donna. You have some experience with club performances.
Sure.
And with making music that other people are dancing to.
Sure. I think my approach to live performance, whether it's audiovisual or if it's music, you know, a lot of it is site-specific, you know, and I think that having to be malleable and willing to work with what you have, I think that, you know, that experience lends a lot to someone like myself who actually experiences their life kind of in between gender. And so I essentially play a role that I'm given at any given moment. So if I'm standing in line to buy a coffee and someone says, "Sir," then that's who I am in that moment. You know, at home I might be they or them, and with other people I might be she, and that's totally fine with me. And I, you know, kind of liken that experience to doing a live performance. And, you know, in my work, again, part of that, of, you know, the type of fluidity that I work with, you know, totally lends to how loose, you know, is structured, in that there is no structure, and that it's entirely improvisational. So whatever I'm given at the moment is what I'm giving back.
I like the idea of improvisation, that term. Maybe whenever we're not acting out the scripts that we are given, we are improvising, we're loose. Tim Trace.
Just a quick response to this question. As a student of Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, this makes me think of what she says about the basic early quote that people are different from each other. And just because two people act a similar way or perform a similar way, it doesn't mean that they are the same. There's something else going on here. And that's why when it comes to discussions of performance, I think my position is that I want to try to break up the binary of performative versus biological. I guess that's how I would answer that.
Thinking about, when you have a binary, you can try to destroy it by showing that the two terms are equal, or showing that the two terms interpenetrate, which doesn't make them equal, or you can try to turn it into a 3-term or a 4-term or a 5-term thing. And
Well,
this
in
is-
order for me to do that, I'd have to tell you my dissertation, which, you know.
I think I know
which
part
you
of your
know,
dissertation.
which you know, but yeah.
It's okay. We're going to get back to whether there are models that are neither performative or biological in a couple of minutes, I think, but I want to hear from Michael first.
I am not a theater scholar, but this brings a couple of things to mind. One thing that it brings to mind for me is the way that I don't think that I really understood Butler's idea of gender as performance until, in a sort of fuller way, until I started trying to present as male and trying to exist that way in the world, or as something on the male side of, you know, a nebulous gender spectrum. But one of the things that's interesting about gender as performance in everyday life that I think theater may help to illuminate is the ways in which a failure to pass in a social setting in the world can sort of be seen as bad art or bad performance. That there's a value judgment attached to how closely one's performance of an identity in a social space corresponds to expected norms. And one of the ways that I think theater can be really exciting is that it, forces us to recognize that we're objectifying actors, that actors are sort of theatrical objects, and sometimes plays can undertake a really complex assimilation of actors and props and language or lines to make us realize that we are sort of going to the theater to objectify actors, or with that expectation. And I think the other thing that it can do is it can show us when we're making a false objectification. Like, I'm thinking especially of, I grew up with a mom who did community theater, and she was in the play La Cage aux Folles, and I remember predictably getting a big kick out of how in the final number of the show, the chorus, members of the chorus line, the dancers of various genders, would all take off their wigs and reveal who was really a chorus girl and who was not. And it was a sort of really playful moment that said, did you objectify us correctly? Oh, look, you were objectifying us. It's an interesting moment. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but just some ideas.
I think it does. And it points right to two different questions I wanted to ask, one of which moves on to another genre entirely, the genre of memoir. And another... Okay. And another stays in the theater performance zone. And let's stay in the theater performance zone for one more question. You were talking about failure to pass as bad art, as seeming like bad art. In another way, you could say that failure to pass is trans art. If you have faded into everybody else's gender system in terms of the way you seem, if you are simply and seamlessly passing and not telling people about your history or how you used to be taken or how your inner feeling complicates the binary, if you're not presenting as trans, you're just presenting as who you wanted to be when you were little, which is one way of being trans, right? And that gets back to memoirs. We'll get back to that. If that's how you're presenting yourself, then however you classify yourself as a person, maybe you're not making trans art. Maybe, this is a hypothesis, I'm not sure I believe it. Maybe something about the bad fit between expectations about gender and its actual performance, maybe something about that failure to pass is not a bug but a feature of the kinds and instances of works of art that we want to identify as trans art. Maybe that's the defining feature, maybe not. We're playing tennis, so Michael?
I feel like I just talked for a long time. I'm supposed to respond to that
It's
idea?
optional. We can go right to Trace.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
my goodness. I think I sort of missed the question. I was focusing on his response. I got the question. I got distracted by his response.
We can do the question
I
as
can
one
talk
short
about,
question.
I know something I could talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah, that was sort of mean, I'm sorry. I didn't really understand the question either, so I thought...
This is my bad
I thought
fit.
she looks very competent.
no, it was a very good question. I wasn't casting any aspersions on the question. I think I would say that one concern for me consistently in my own writing has been this kind of associating this failure to pass with the real, or with some condition that you keep sort of falling back to, and you keep sort of aspiring to something and you keep sort of falling short of it a little bit. And yeah, I think probably everyone experiences that. I mean, personally, I don't think that, I mean, this may piss some people off, but I don't really think that anybody passes per se. It's a very complicated thing. I mean, gender doesn't work that way. I mean, at least I don't want to live in a world where gender works that way, where you just have this boxes that people are trying to fit into the X box or the Y box or whatever, or the PlayStation or whatever.
Yeah. Stephanie, if I could actually, that did make me think of something.
Yes,
A brief answer. I think sometimes inviting other people to experience, if only momentarily, the sort of humorous complexities of not passing can be really instructive and really interesting. I was riding the T, this is just anecdotal, I guess, but I was riding the T and a man, older man, like maybe in his 50s, not in a cruel way, said, "Are you a male or a female? I can't rightly tell." And I said, "You know, have a nice day." It didn't clear it up for him. And it was sort of a great moment we had. Like, I don't know. Does it matter? What do you think? Do you know what I mean? So I think that actually can be really productive in that it can make non-transgender or non-genderqueer people think, well, when do I feel masculine? When do I feel feminine? When do I feel in touch with whatever gender I express in the world? It's complicated.
It's complicated. I see it's complicated as a sort of crawl across the bottom of the screen. Should I try to rephrase the question concisely?
Yes, please.
Actually,
Is the bad fit or the loose fit between gender norms and actual self-presentation that many trans people feel, either if we're failing to pass or if we're not trying to pass, is that bad fit not something that makes trans art fail, but something that defines art as trans?
Yes.
Okay.
That is all. No, I'm kidding.
I can say something.
I'm thinking of the departures from realism in your video work.
Yeah, no, I'm actually, you know, you're on a really interesting thread, I think. You know, again, I think it comes back to the individual's intention, right? I'm someone, again, who really enjoys kind of existing nowhere and everywhere at the same time, and to me, that's perfect. That might not be perfect for someone else, and someone's idea of what good art might be is, you know, precision, perfection, you know, reality, realness. And for other people, it might be something that's more messy, something that's disjointed, disconnected, deconstructed. Again, it's all in the eye of the beholder. And, you know, I had a similar experience, I think, to you, where I was out somewhere and an older gentleman, oddly enough, you know, he said that in a very wonderful way, but he called me a twofer, and I was like, what is that? Because, what is that? And apparently it's, you know, someone who embodies both male and female characteristics, I guess, but he was not at all put off by it. He was really, you know, interested, and not in a way that felt like fetishized or anything. It was a true moment of like appreciation of one person to the other. Also, he was wearing a like airbrushed Red Fox denim outfit from head to toe. So we had a really great moment of like, you know, you look great, so do you, cool, you know. So again, it's all in the eye of the beholder, and you know, again, it's complicated, right? Like there's no one way to answer this question at all. I think it's really up to the individual and what you, again, put into what you're putting out in the world.
Let's start naming a few more works, by the way. One of the things I was hoping we'd come away with was more of a reading list. I've got my own reading list, but naming creators and creations as we explore these questions. Michael, do you want to talk about Bad Fit?
Sure. I was thinking that the very notion of passing, right, which we actually see in African-American racial literature and in lots of other places. It's not just the trans issue. You know, I think passing is very complicated. It means something to the people who are passing, to the people who are not passing, to the people whom they are passing for or to. You know, so it's all very transient. You know. So, but I think that if we begin to look at, you know, I mean, in what ways does passing, depending upon the person, right, really just reestablish and reiterate normality and normalcy and roles, you know. But I also think I want to go back to the early question about theater a little bit, you know, that in fact being out in the world and just being present, whether on a subway and meeting this, I must say 50 is not elderly, I'm 64, 50 is young. You know, if we see that as a piece of sort of street theater, if we see that as that sort of interaction, you know, if you look at modern theater, right, it's sort of defined by either theater of cruelty from Artaud or theater of the absurd. And I think that if we view all these interactions as just being out in the world as theatrical performances, that might actually, the notion of good fit, bad fit may take a different sort of notion then.
Yeah. So on the note of reading lists, I do have a poem here that was written by a good friend of mine that speaks to that same
Is
situation.
that audible?
Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay, good, thanks. I did bring it up on the talks about precisely that situation, the being on the subway and sort of failing to be read as one or the other. I don't want to jump in and leap into reading poetry now if it's not a thing that we're doing now, but...
Actually, it can be, yeah.
Cool. Well, neat. I'm going to jump in and read a poem then. This is not mine, but it's by a poet, BXK, who's a Harvard undergrad who I admire very much.
DXK?
BXK.
BXK.
Yes, they're really wonderful. So the other day, I'm sitting in the subway and the person across from me is staring at my, like there was a really good talk show going on. Ellen DeGeneres prancing around on my fly. Do you want to take a picture? Let's be real. My package is attractive, but you're more interested in the goods, and by goods you mean genitals, and by genitals you mean gender, and by gender you just want an answer, in which case you're asking the wrong girl, boy, woman, man, trans, send these boxes. Building with barricades, locked doors on each floor whose windows open into the sky. And you wonder why suicide rates are so high for folks who can't live in your architecture. Restroom glares, as if you're surprised that people like me have to pee sometimes. To have strangers stare, trying to puzzle out your penis-shaped package into an identity. It's a game for the pronoun grand prize. He, him, his for the Adam's apple, or she, her, hers for the bra strap. And if you don't win, well then show shit you saw an it on the train today. When I get dressed in the morning, when I feel like it, I pack. No one knows, really, unless they're feeling around, which they really shouldn't be. It's not a penis, then it doesn't mean that I want a penis. It's just for me. It makes me feel comfortable in a body that's confusing sometimes. You know what I mean, right? Every month when I menstruate, I tie my ties a little tighter, as if the cloth clinging to my neck would convince my sex to stop bleeding so I can keep breathing. Breasts that spill out of their binding, fill the F in female, fill my nostrils with the wind coming through that open window. It's not that I'm fucking with gender, it's gender that's fucking with me. Where's the urgency? The flags are up. They aren't rainbow, they're white, because I can't think about pride when we're in the height of this. It's an emergency that we face, because there isn't a way that I can say, check the box outside M or F without checking out of the human race. But it's not too late to evacuate, Escape and avoid the worst. Be sure the children get out first. Call them smart instead of pretty, and friendly instead of tough. Start from the start so when they meet someone who's different from them, whether in the sandbox or on the subway, they can smile and look them in the eye instead of in the crotch. Because if you're looking for an answer about my gender in my genitals, I've tried being polite, but honestly, fuck it. If you want to know if it's a penis, you can suck it.
What?
I have a clip I could follow,
Oh, yeah.
if it works out.
Yes, please, clip.
Are we going to do brief statements too?
Oh, yes, there will be time. You have a statement.
Yeah.
Let's have a clip and then a statement.
Sure. I only bring up the clip because we're talking about the subway and kind of passing or not passing. And, you know, again, a lot of my work, you know, it's centered around passing or not passing. And that also deals a lot with racial ambiguity. And I do have a very brief, like 1 minute or so, clip of an interview that I did with someone who's in my project that kind of talks about being on the bus. So is it okay if I?
Yes, please. Do you
Sure.
go up and play it yourself with the computer?
Yeah,
Great.
I'll go do that.
Great.
And someone else can talk while I do that, I guess.
Okay. I'll give you a preview of 3 places that we're going to go, I think, after we see the clip. And after, Trace, you have a statement. Michael, you do not. Okay, participants, we're told if you've got work you want to present that is written out in advance, please bring a statement, but if they're not expected. This is primarily a conversation.
Does anyone else have a statement?
I brought some poems, but I can read them or not. We'll see how things develop.
I think we're going to hear at least one.
So I don't need to, that's fine, if nobody else is.
I think we're about to have a clip.
Do you pass? Do I pass? Oh God, what? I don't know. Do you pass as anything? No. It's the short answer. Sitting on a bus, and they're just like, they look at you, and then they do the double take. They look at you, and then they do the double take. It's this perception that you are not dangerous, and it's not something I've ever experienced before. That really puts me in this weird place of like, I know I'm not dangerous, but now because I have this exterior that I think looks good on me, makes me feel good, doesn't make other people feel good. And it's weird, because how do you not know people something that you're they look at you, and then they do the double take.
I don't know if you can really hear the volume on that is not so good, but you know, he's talking about the double take that you get when you don't quite fit into someone's box, and how the added layer, I suppose, of race when you don't fit into a box really kind of comes to play when you're kind of navigating the world outside. So in this particular case, he's talking about people seeing him as a dangerous person now because he looks like, a young, brown teenage boy as instead of a young brown woman, and what that really means for people in public spaces and how that can actually affect your own transness and how you perform gender as well.
Do you want to talk more? We'll see more of it this evening, but do you want to talk more about what Project Loose is, what this larger video and multimedia work of which that clip was a part is?
Sure. Yeah, so that clip kind of came a little bit before the development, the final development of my project, but Essentially, Loose is a documentary project that is also a performance. It's autobiographical. I interview other gender nonconforming and trans people of color about their experiences of navigating public space, but it's also an investigation of the metaphysical aspects of passing. And, you know, the reason why I decided to delve into that realm is because one of the things that I experienced kind of passing and not passing between space is the actual physical feelings that you experience from that. It really does actually feel like an out-of-body experience, and that was something that I was feeling, and I started asking participants of my project if that's what they were feeling as well, and across the board, absolutely yes. And so that was became a larger part of the narrative in the piece, and really informed how I developed the piece as it being, you know, site-specific, that it's improvisational, that it's a performance in and of itself. So essentially, I interview people, I take the audio and video tracks, I chop it up into little bits, put it in a database, and then I do a live performance of it. So it's a performance about performativity, I suppose, right? And about race and racial drag, and you know, the nebulous space of kind of living in between, and kind of liminal space and liminality, and those are the types of things that we discuss in that work.
I have a quick question.
Trace, who is here, go on.
Do you mind if I just present something for a few minutes?
I was about to ask you to do that.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay, can I speak into this? Yes. Okay, so I'm just going to talk for a minute about troubling the line, which is the... Now, how do I... Well, since I'm standing here anyway,
We have just the web page, the EOA web page from the site. Do you want that?
No, it's okay. I can. We could just do it as full screen, and then probably scroll through. Yes. Okay, so this works. Okay. So this is Troubling the Line: Trans and Genderqueer Poetry and Poetics. This came out from the Nightboat Books in March of this year. It has, as you can see here on the book cover, 54 trans and genderqueer identified poets. I'd say, I don't want to give the ratios, but it's a pretty diverse group of people. There's a good percentage of transsexuals. There's a good percentage of people who are cross-dressers or identified but not actually transitioned. There are other people who, there's just a wide range of different perspectives on trans and genderqueer as an identity as it relates to art. And I edited this book with T.C. Tolbert. And we talked about it being a bridge project, or being a project that connected different communities in the trans, among trans-identified people. And I also wanted to say that sort of, so one of the things I said in the introduction as the, my position as the editor of this book is, as a trans-identified poet, editor, and scholar, what I want is a poetry with a connection to the biological, but a biological that relies upon neither gender essentialism nor reproductive teleology as defining characteristics. So by that I mean, gender binaries, gender essentialism, and also assumptions about evolutionary reproduction, sort of heteronormative assumptions about that something is only worth doing if it leads to more reproduction and survival of the fittest, survival of the species, etc. I want to try to explore a poetry that's against and around doing something different around that. I also just, I had gone through and outlined some themes among poets in the book. Stephen Burt and Max Wolf-Valerio both talk quite a bit about the imagination. This is the abbreviated version, so I won't quote from everyone, but another trend among poets in the book is Kit Yan, the performance poet, and T.T. Jacks. Both talk quite a bit about guts, about the role of intestines in their writing and how they write with their stomachs. So sometimes there are internal issues here as opposed to just issues of presentation. Another theme among a lot of these poets is trauma. Having suffered, I was really stunned by something like a third of the poets in the book talked about having suffered some kind of a childhood trauma and their connection to writing being connected to working through this trauma and healing from it. That writing was a kind of survival, really, that was associated with either, being ridiculed, being bullied, being abused, any range of different problems you might experience as a child. So there's a sort of going back to childhood and healing things that happened in childhood. And those are two things that come up in the statements of Yosme Del Mazo and Stacey Waite. Another thing is just that I think trans poets tend to not want to answer prompts directly, as we ourselves are doing on this panel, or perhaps that I'm doing in response to.
I'm giving you prompts, and it's wrong. I shouldn't do it. I owe you all an apology.
It really is like herding cats. I mean, it was a wonderful experience doing this book, but it really was like herding cats while trying to nail Jell-O to the cats. So there was a lot of negotiation with everybody about, we're looking for this, and can we make it a little more specific towards this kind of a statement. But so one thing that people did very expertly, and that I found myself doing even when it came time for me to write my statement, is that they wrote the statement about how they can't quite bring themselves to write the statement, which is kind of an interesting idea. So some of the people who did that were Zoe Tuck and Ari Banyas, and Waima Drone. Trish Salah's poetic statement in particular, she talked a lot about not having had her coffee yet, so not being herself yet. I'm telling you about my poetics, but I'm not quite myself yet. I haven't quite had my coffee yet. So this idea of what is your ideal self? When do you approach that self? When do you reach it? And finally, just a brief thing. I wanted to talk a little bit about people who are going beyond binary thinking, because I see this as kind of a trans aesthetic that Buddhism comes into play for me in the writing of thinking of Sedgwick and people like this, where there are a lot of constructions that, as Leslie Scalapino would say, wreck the mind. The more you try to meditate upon them, the more complicated they get. What Stephen was saying before about it's complicated, running below the discussion. So just a few of these include Meg Day, who talks about the notion of the selves we are just barely discovering, and how that discovery would allow us to bring our particular amalgam of margins to the core, which is a beautiful phrase. Burt himself, or herself, describes the, quote, both and, neither nor, what if, but also, something other than a continuous story about one body and one life, which I found very moving. And E.C. Crandall talks about a relationship between performance, body, and text when he says, quote, a grounded poetry is melodramatic, the electrostatic between two bodies. And he has this wonderful formulation that reminded me a little bit of what Donna was saying about inhabiting, you were saying about inhabiting your work. Quote, my body should make a quarter turn when you read it inside your skin. Okay, and here's just a few more poets. Carrie Edwards, who is a mentor of mine, Misha Cardenas. Misha Cardenas has an idea of something called the trans-real, which I think is very interesting. It's a new media concept, and it has to do with the idea of mixed reality. If any of you are familiar with new media studies, that you have multiple realities happening at once, and they're all real. One of them is not pretend, that there's a simultaneity to that, and Misha Cardenas is sort of this interest in virtual reality as a foundation for her trans experience. And then Eileen Miles and Samuel Ace. And I'll just wrap up with Samuel Ace, who's a dear friend of mine and who said something that's very influential to me, which is just that we have to be our own manifestos. That there's something about, when it comes to art, I think it's not an issue of like being part of some other person's thing or being included, that we really, as trans artists and writers, we really have to help to create the context for our own work, and to just live it and be it. And yeah, so we have to be our own manifestos. Anyway, thank you. Oh, and one more image here. This is probably the most trans poets you've seen in one place. This was at the launch. Yeah. And you can see Stephanie up on the right there. But this was the launch, and this is actually only about half of the poets in the book. So, yeah.
Thank you for orchestrating that event, which was in Boston in March. Trish, you said that trans artists have to create the context by which we are going to be read. And that's William Wordsworth, who, as far as I know, is not a trans artist, said the same thing, as some of you know. One of the themes that's developing this evening is the difficulty in making generalizations about what is or isn't a trans art. Another one has to do with bad fit, with difficulty, and maybe a third has to do with trans art as a special case of all art, in that nobody fits into their body, nobody's just one thing. All art that is original is creating the contexts by which it's going to be read. I had 3 places I wanted to go. I want to be sure that anything else that is a clip that should be played gets played. Kat, you had another poem for performance that was a clip that you wanted us to see, right?
I did, right.
Okay. I have things I want us to see and hear, but they are not video. They are still images or words with no pictures. So let's see the video first. You can introduce the poem while we do that, or I can do that.
That's an excellent idea. So I guess I want to introduce this in the context of the form in which it's written. I, first came into sort of doing poetry at Harvard in the spoken word community here. I'm on the slam team that's going to be going to the College Union Poetry Slam Invitational in Boulder in the spring, which is really, really neat and which has provided a very different context for art than I was sort of used to for a long time. slam poems, they were the form was created as a way to bring community together. It wasn't about technical expertise. It was sort of in opposition to the idea that you had to have elite training or, really tight, specific standards of form in order to be a poet or in order to get a point across or be an artist. And so slam poems, they exist in 3 minutes. The rules are no props. You can make noises with your body. You have whatever you sort of bring with you to the stage. And whatever it is that you give to your audience, they also give back to you. There's a lot of emphasis on responding, on making noises, on snapping, on those sort of like oohs and ahs that you associate with cheesy poetry clubs. But the energy in spoken word is very, very different from any other sort of art environment that I've encountered. But so because of this, and I think because of the sort of intimate relationship between spoken word poets or slam poets and their audiences, because there is an interaction there's a sort of emphasis on getting issues that will sort of get to people, and I think that they provide a really specific space for trans poets, both in that it's a place where they know that they will be heard, not trying to find a publisher, not trying to sort of blend in or be saleable, but it's also a place that there is validation happening in that present moment, which isn't present in a lot of writing that you send off or it gets published on paper or something, but there isn't that same line of communication. So with that very long introduction, is the screen? Yeah, it works. This is a playlist of different trans poems, which you can find on YouTube. But this particular one, I think, is really beautiful and, speaks for itself.
Love for Team Philly.
The Here poem is about transgender issues. You have this one being expressed through two people. One side's the boy, one side's the girl.
Melissa sits in the back of the classroom afraid to speak up. She pulls awkwardly at her extra loose khaki cargo pants. She doesn't want the boys to notice her.
James finds himself in the back of the classroom. His baseball cap casts a shadow on his pimple-stained forehead. A white shirt hangs on his broad shoulders. But no one ever noticed him.
Melissa, the teacher asks. And she says nothing because she is not here. And Melissa has never been here because Melissa is just some abstract jumble of syllables that doesn't fit her position. She's not what she seems. She doesn't want to have to explain to her mother for the 232nd time why she doesn't want to wear a dress to prom. Doesn't paint her face, it's because the whole body's painted on.
Melissa, James doesn't want to have to explain where he came from. Because with the exception of Melissa, he has been deemed an abstract reality by everyone. All he wishes for is to get to wear a tuxedo to prom.
And Melissa has been tugging at breasts steadily growing for 3 years now. Been using duct tape to press them down and mold them more into pecs. She just wishes that people would understand that at birth, her genitals didn't know which way to grow. Mad at God who couldn't relay the message directly to her hormones that they should produce more testosterone. The only person who understands her is James. And they've been playmates since the age of 4. Around the time girls noticed boys.
And boys noticed girls.
See, James's family wanted daughters
instead of sons.
And Melissa was always like that male beetle that everyone called a ladybug.
Melissa,
where is she? Sometimes she wishes she could rip the skin off her back. And every moment of every day she feels touched in the flesh of a stranger. Melissa! And she stands to her feet, wanting to say, I'm here, and I've been here since I was born. So we're asking if I'm a him or a her. Because when you combine the two pronouns, you get H-I-R, here. And God combined the two genders and put me in this body transgendered. I'm here, so quit talking about me like I'm not here. James falls back into Melissa's skin, and the two comfort each other in their syncopated heartbeats, waiting for the day when Melissa can finally scrub off this made-up genetic makeup. When the teacher asks for James, and he can say,
I'm here.
That's great, thank you.
We're coming, that was amazing, and I imagine it will be forwarded rapidly. And I suppose it's already being forwarded, it's out there. And it's bringing us back to questions about live theater as experience and metaphor for the ways of being trans that are out there. And about unrealistic live theater, live theater that doesn't simply replicate what we're brought up to be used to as a good metaphor and instance of trans art. And I wanted to go to comedy and tragedy, which are other kinds of art, and I wanted to go to memoir, and I wanted to go to visual experience. And I had a couple of things that I wanted to throw out there or to show you as instances of kinds of hello, video machine, kinds of trans art that are out there. We've been seeing moving images and we've been hearing words, but there are also still images in comics. Like performance poetry, as we now call it, webcomics are a really new medium. And if we're looking for kinds of trans art, we need to look there. And like performance poetry, it's a democratic medium that people seem to feel has low barriers to entry and very little institutionalization of what's acceptable. I think that's going to change. I think there's going to be more critical and theoretical looking at them. But this is one webcomic I've been enjoying quite a lot. And it comes out of a Japanese visual tradition. But it's about trans teens. And if I'm not going to take you through the different panels very much, but it uses the flatness, and the Rain, who is the protagonist, is a trans teen who's living as a girl for the first time, and not everyone in her new high school knows that she used to be Ryan. And it builds up a sort of soap operatic cast of teens and grown-ups, many of whom have their own complicated genders. In a way, it continues what we've been looking at about performance. Do these characters look like what they do? And in a way, it is an alternative to performance because these characters have bodies that aren't real. These characters have bodies that look the way they have been drawn. And if you do comic scholarship, and there is some of that out there, you can see how much viewer identification is encouraged by these images. You get to be the schematic person if you want to. You can identify with her more or differently than you can identify with a photorealist image or a real person on a stage. And I wanted to get the unique potential of comics as a trans art form out there. And this is just one example among others. And let's see. So comics, I think, are new in the repertoire of ways to be trans in art. The oldest one, or the most influential one, might be the memoir. I'm not sure if there's a canon of trans fiction or trans poetry yet. It's possible that the canon of trans poetry starts with this book. Check it out. Thank you, and thank you for the tour of who's in it. But I'm pretty sure there's a trans memoir canon. And memoir, autobiography, life writing, very much including another book you should all buy, A Queer in Pleasant Danger. Memoir is the story of one life and one supposedly real identity. And that from the moment that before transgender was a word that we encountered, there were memoirs about being it or having been it. And that is a matter of literary history as well as of making art now. And I'm going to break my tennis rule and not start with Kat, but start with Michael Bronski.
Right. And
the history of trans memoir.
I'm not sure where to begin exactly. I mean, what I was thinking, as you're speaking, and I mentioned her before, there's actually Charlotte Shark, who is just after Shakespeare, 17th century, I guess, actress who actually passed as a man who wrote a memoir. I mean, I think that when we're looking at it, I think when you're looking at the history of memoir, I mean, it depends on how you might define memoir. I mean, certainly we have, cross-dressing women throughout Henry Fielding novels, throughout other places, someone like Moll Cutpurse, who is a fictional character. And as that goes through the Victorian times, right, we certainly have other people in fiction. I mean, I think so. Looking at a memoir, I'd actually want to expand it somewhat and actually not just do personal memoir, but actually do fictional memoirs as well as some sort of projection from the author.
By fictional memoirs, you mean works of fiction that present themselves, things like Daniel Defoe's Moll Flanders, as if they were memoir.
If they were, but also even enlarging it a little bit more and actually thinking of, because any author who writes a work of fiction puts her or himself in it to some degree, and particularly if there's a, say, Samuel Richardson writing about Clarissa or about Pamela, right? Clearly there's a trans element to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just a little bit suspicious of sort of, if we look at the genre of memoir, I think it's rather limiting, and I'd rather explode it a bit, and sort of look at trans as more as an imaginative leap or feat.
Okay.
So why, if we're looking at like Richardson's novel Pamela or the later one Clarissa, why not view that as a trans work? Because we actually know Richardson's life is actually he's quite female identified. He's sort of hysterical all the time. I mean, this was a critique of him, right? He actually was able to write this fiction because of this composure that he had.
Okay.
So I would sort of expand or even explode the notion of what a memoir is and make it large, because I think it's actually rather constricting.
You're making me feel terribly presentist. And usually, it's odd. Usually, I'm the person in these kinds of panels saying, no, gay and lesbian writing doesn't start with Stonewall. No, same-sex desire in literature doesn't start with Oscar Wilde or Whitman. No, we need to go back farther. Literature is great and vast. And I find myself in the unfamiliar position of saying, no, but there's something really important that starts more recently, which is books that not only can we see them as trans writing now, but books that are received by the people who purchase them as true statements about actual lives put down by the people who live them, and books that respond to one another. I was wondering what the first one would be, whether Christine Jorgensen is the first one. The first one that is read as literature with some attention to how the sentences sound is, I thought it was Jan Morris's Conundrum, but I may have missed one. But whether it's worth thinking about the smaller scale tradition of trans memoirs, and about the place that memoir, that life writing holds in a larger project of trans and genderqueer self-representation. I hope I'm complicating or troubling your line rather than contradicting you.
That's fine. Trouble away.
Okay. Hannah, do you want to take that about memoir, life writing?
Sure. I think we're really in an interesting time in terms of memoir being the immediacy of connecting with people and sharing stories actually online. And communities that are being built beyond physical books or in the classroom or in your own personal experience as you're out in the world, but connecting with people in kind of a virtual sense. There's, we owe a lot of debt to trans discourse in terms of, relating back to ideas of, the cyborg or things like that. And I think that, I try to kind of steer clear of that a little bit, because that's not how I personally experience transness. But there is something to be said about, leaving, being somewhere, being in a place and then being somewhere else all at the same time. So the simultaneity of existence. And, I think, again, like we can, as trans individuals, kind of exist in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different spaces. And when you relate that back to connecting online and, virtual worlds and, creating spaces where they didn't before, the reach is much more broad. And I think that the idea of the memoir or sharing your experiences or real life can exist outside of like the physical book or, live theater or something like that. And, it keeps changing very rapidly. I think that a lot of people were finding themselves, more recently in the last several years on YouTube or what have you, people sharing their stories, very intimate, personal, stories, people injecting hormones and things like that online, sharing, things that, you wouldn't normally see, anywhere else. And that's shifting even more now, where a lot of younger people are now on Tumblr, where that has a different type of interactivity, and the attention that is required for that is starting to change a lot too. And I think that writing, as we move more towards a digital age, is starting to change as well. So the idea of what writing is itself is starting to change.
Wow. Can I try to condense one of the claims you've just made, and then we should hear from Trace and from Michael? I think you are saying that in the new internet age, we are no longer as dependent on previously recognized ways of using words and images and bodies. We are no longer as dependent on a book called a memoir or a thing that has to happen in a theater.
Like in a singular space, yeah, absolutely. I think that it can exist in a lot of different ways, and that, the memoir is still a memoir, but I think that how people are expressing themselves and sharing their stories is really starting to change, because I think, memoirs have always been kind of about gatekeeping in terms of like publishing and things like that, and I think that that's starting to break down quite a bit.
Yeah. I want to bring up a YouTube site that I think is relevant to what Dahan is saying, but, and I'm going to find it while we hear from Trace.
So this question's about memoir. Two things occur to me. One is the lack of, one of the conditions that's been weird for me has been the absence of models of trans poets, existing trans poets who were older, who I could look to and say, oh, I want to be like that person. I want to be, that person makes it possible what I want to do. And I can sort of build on what they're working on. I felt this way about a number of people's work, like Kate Bornstein, Susan Stryker, and so forth, people who are writers on trans issues and who might be working in Joy Layden has been another person who's been very influential for me. People who are working on making visible these issues, but the idea of being a poet is just so weird to people. I mean, that's every relationship that for me that has never worked, is because they thought, oh, the trans issues were interesting, but you write poetry, so.
I have a stack that I've brought from my office of trans-relevant books that you would see on any kind of syllabus or bookshelf, that are trans books that are part of a self-conscious tradition to which other trans writers respond. So that Bear Bergman S. Bear Bergman is responding to, as well as working with Kate Bornstein, and Nick Krieger, I think, is responding both to Kate Bornstein and to Jenny Boylan, whose work I absolutely love, but whose story some, especially younger writers, see as, in a way, heteronormative. So there's this line in memoir and in essay writing. But in poetry, there's not the same sense that one set of writers is responding to a previous set of writers who share that identification.
Yeah, and not really in fiction either, and that's pretty interesting. It's like we're kind of all hashing that out collectively. I mean, one of the, there's several interesting projects that came out of Troubling the Line. One wonderful poet, Amir Rabaya, has just gotten a new anthology that he's doing now. It's called Writing the Walls Down, and it's talking about metaphors of walls, and it's a sort of trans and queer anthology, and I think that's very exciting. It's coming out from Transgenre Press. There's a lot of people interpreting genre differently, and I think that memoir gets kind of folded in. I think what interests me is when you can fold memoir into fiction or poetry. And there's one more point I had to make, which was I was listening to Michael, what you were saying before, and it made me think of the example of Myra Breckinridge, which I think is a really wonderful book, and it's really kind of, I don't know, it seems like a sympathetic depiction of a trans person. It's sort of a person who is really a pretty savvy woman who's, planning things and strategizing and very engaged in her own existence. And, it might be a caricature in some ways, but in some ways it also does, and we could go even further back to books like The Well of Loneliness. I think Sarah Schulman has mentioned to me that should be considered part of trans literature. I mean, there's a question of how far back does all this go, and how much is memoir implicated?
Yeah, I love the way you speak to Michael Bronski's question there. I want to get back to Myra Breckinridge, but not as much as I want to hear from Michael.
Well, I think that we run the risk of, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I agree that it's very important that a body of literature that is sort of self-consciously created as trans or genderqueer literature for people who identify that way is important. But I think part of the reason that memoir is such a prevalent genre is determined by the marketplace and by the fact that a lot of people who are curious about trans issues who don't identify that way want to know the facts. They want to know, in a way that I understand and in a way that I think is instinctive. They want to know, what parts do you have, or what are you going to do about being trans, or what does it what does it involve to be trans? How did you find out? Are you still the same person you were? Someone asked me that, actually, and that was it's a hard question to answer. I'm not. Who was I before? But so I think that it's very important that memoir exists. But I really appreciate what you were saying, Michael, about the importance of looking to sources that don't explicitly sort of foreground their transness or might not have those terms available. So there is a lack of a tradition, but one of the reasons that personally, I can only speak from my experience, that I feel drawn to poetry, especially to poetry that announces its own difficulty, is that it feels like often there's something being fended off or resisted, or some sort of multifarious categories of experience being assimilated into one work of art. Or sort of something that is a given, that has been taken to be, understood by everyone, that is then being questioned or problematized. And a lot of poets and writers who do that are non-normative in gender or sexuality, but a lot of them aren't. A lot of them have other minority status as, race, ethnicity, religion. I think we need to not paint ourselves into a corner and say that only trans art that declares itself to belong to that category can speak to our situation.
Yeah, I agree. Michael has a direct response.
Sort of direct response, a direct response to everybody. I think that what we're saying about gatekeeping is so true. I actually used to review, for a Publishers Weekly, I'd review 5 or 7 books a week for about 10 years, and I mostly read all of them, mostly. It was at a time when a lot of, it was certainly after Conundrum, it was after Second Serve by Renee Richards, came out, and there was getting to be more of a trans memoir genre, and it was just amazing to me, and some of them were good, some of them were bad, some of them were sort of indifferent, right? But they all adhered to certain forms, they all followed certain things, because it's the publishing industry, it's an industry, and they pretty much will break out of a mode if they think they can make money, and if they don't, then you're back in that very secure mode, right? So it seemed to me that even when we're looking at, and I love The Will of Loneliness, and I want to talk about Myra Breckinridge in a minute, right? But if we take the Christine Jorgensen book as the sort of prototype, right? So much of the trans memoir was really based on sort of a Hollywood autobiography model, which is great. I mean, it's highly entertaining, and it's often not very true. Mostly not very true, right? So that a lot of the trans memoir is that I think really and I think this explained my sort of hesitancy why I wanted to jump back to 1741 and Samuel Richardson to sort of avoid the genre. The genre itself really inhibits truthfulness. I mean, truth can seep in and out, And what I love about Myra Breckinridge, right, which I think is a brilliant novel, only followed by Myron, which is the follow-up, right, is that what in fact Gore Vidal does, is that he actually takes the Hollywood memoir, the sort of movie star memoir, and completely explodes it. Because the book is actually exposing the hypocrisy of gender roles, the hypocrisy of Hollywood, the power of the woman trapped in a 1940s movie. And so that, in fact, if we view Myra Breckinridge as not as a trans novel particularly, but as actually some form of hypothetical trans memoir, I think it leads to brand new directions, which many of the, she's still here. Other books are perfectly good. I mean, and some of them are great, right? But I think they are really limiting. I really would go more for the fictional, as I said before, not sort of expansion, but explosion of what that means to really get to some sort of truth.
If I might add, actually, if you look into the tradition of documentary production as well, which is in and of itself, its own kind of memoir, I think that there is an absolute template that goes along into producing documentaries. And then, the goal in documentary making is to tell the truth. But, there are so many things at play in that. There is script writing, in fact. And I think that it's kind of, your version of the truth as opposed to what, could be, really happening in the moment. And so I think that that's hopefully, I tried to play around with that idea a little bit of, deconstructing the idea of the documentary, especially when it comes to documenting the lives of people who have so much complexity in their own identity and how they might, how they all kind of play together. So why not kind of upset that template as well? Yeah.
Also, I just want to quickly mention is that, and it like hadn't come up because it never comes up, right? But there's I would consider a great, brilliant trans novel memoir probably that is assigned in high schools and has been since the 60s, which is Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers, which is an incredible novel. Sarah Schulman actually has argued that, in fact, Carson McCullers herself, if she was alive today, would be a trans person. And if you haven't read it, you should read it. It's absolutely brilliant. But, it's interesting. It's such a subversive novel, and yet it is taught in high schools. And I think in those ways we can really think about literature as transforming people's lives in ways that people who are assigned books in high school never even imagine.
Yeah, another example I just thought of while Donna and Michael, while you were both talking, was something Donna said reminded me of this. There's this movie Prodigal Sons that's a trans memoir, but I think it's a particularly effective example of the genre because of how the trans story it's part of the background rather than part of the foreground. The memoir is about the protagonist's brother and how they find out he's related to Orson Welles, and it's about his brother's mental illness and everything else. And the protagonist, the documentarian, is in the movie as a trans woman, but it's sort of an unremarkable thing compared to the brother. All the focus is on this other character and the other drama happening.
Thanks. I wanted to ask one more question about the future, because so much has changed so fast for trans people that I want to know what comes next, if not in life, then in art. But maybe I want to leave that question on the table because I want to be sure we have enough time for questions from people who are in the blue and gray and green seats out there. That would be the audience. And to thank you again for coming and to remind you, so we don't have to remind you at 6:29.5, that at 7:30 we will reconvene for Project Loose, part of the video project of Dahana Perry, and for Kate Bornstein's performance, which is something I've been hoping myself to see for a very, very long time. So if you go away, don't go far and come back at 7:30. Right now, are there hands up? Yeah. I do have the mic.
Can you just write to Should we put the lights up?
We maybe want to show an image.
Oh, all right.
So I need to stand. Hi, can you hear me now? Okay. I just had a quick question for the panel in terms of the idea of something being passable. Is it negate the whole idea of being transgendered, because the construct of being passable as opposed to being transgendered, you're not really fitting into an ideal. So I'm just curious as to your thoughts about that.
I think passing and being trans are two different things. Right. And yeah, I don't know. I'm just gonna stop there, I think.
Michael.
I'm not totally sure are you saying, or are you asking that if a person can live stealth, as they say, and not be recognized as a trans person, that then that negates the trans identity? Is that what you mean?
I was more interested in Stephanie's comment earlier about the idea of something being passable, the idea of fitting in, and how doesn't that kind of negate the idea of being trans, being trans art? Trans art, by definition, isn't something that can be easily quantified or defined. I mean, that's my take on it.
I think it really, do you want to actually answer?
I do have a quick answer
Sure.
to that. The poet Samuel Ace has this wonderful book called Stealth, which was co-written with Maureen Seaton, who's a cis female lesbian poet. And part of the point of the book is you can't tell who wrote which parts. And to me, there's something about, it doesn't negate the trans identity, I don't think, but I think that there is a certain kind of trans aesthetic which is concerned with stealth and concerned with, spy metaphors and things like this. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I have been unfavorably disparaged by this person or that person as a sort of J. Edgar Hoover type. I mean, these tropes tend to set up a circuit that goes both ways. So when we're talking about spies and when we're talking about stealth, we do start to talk about trans people and trans experience, I think. The two things have sort of bled into each other at this point.
If I could speak to your question just for a second, I can only speak to it autobiographically, I guess. As someone who is still in the transition process, I think for a lot of trans people, there's a sense of wanting to either get past the identity and have one's gender be a given, like everybody else's, or sort of claiming it as continuing to be a person in transition. For me, it's important to think, well, I might never pass. You know what I mean? I might never be able to live stealth, but I don't think I would want the transgender aspect of my experience to be negated. In other words, I will always have spent a certain number of years of my life as a female-bodied, female-identified person. That's me. That's important to me. And I think that for a lot of trans people, they wouldn't disown their experience before or during transition, even if they hope to pass someday. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. I have so much more to say in answer to that myself. I'm going to say it in writing later and move on to another question.
Hello. If this question is out of order, just let me know. I'm wondering if this rule within the category of trans literature and drama and all of that, for the ironic, the parodic, the Rabelaisian, I'm thinking of certain documentary films made during the early days of the gay pride marches in Washington and New York City. One of the characters who appeared in a film made by a person I knew was a man with a beard wearing the outfit of a nun. And I believe also that, since I knew him personally, he identified as a mothering male. Now, I understand this might appeal to some transgendered people and not appeal to others, but the question is there room for irony and parody and the carnivalesque within trans literature and experience?
I have a very direct answer to that. I think that within, I don't know how to explain this. I think that something tends to happen in, oh God, where do I start answering this question? I do have a very direct answer to that. I'm tongue-tied a little bit. I think it's too hard. I can't.
I think that
I'll come back to it.
if I can stall for time for you. No, I think that that's a definite component of various genderqueer identities that is really important. My sort of first real-world experience with anyone who is trans-identified, one of my mother's works with transgendered veterans of war, but I had never known any of them or anything, was I did a drag workshop when I must have been 12 or 13 years old. We were this group of female-bodied people who, put on fake beards and did Justin Timberlake's Sexy Back, and there was boys who were doing the Spice Girls, and it was so much fun, and to a lot of us, there were elements of ridiculousness and parody, but it was also very genuine, I think. And sort of my experience since then has been, seeing that not so much, or not consistently or across the board, that gender is something that needs to be taken totally seriously. I think that that's a lot of what I want to see in trans art, is the idea not that gender is oppressive or not that gender needs to be destroyed or altered in some fundamental way, but that we need different frameworks for seeing it in. Seeing it as a thing that can both be serious and can be a very important part of someone's life, but also something that can be fun and can be joyful and can be sort of a tool or something that a person can sculpt rather than something that a person has to choose. Does that make sense?
Let's try laughing with trans people about the ridiculousness of gender rather than laughing at them. Or let's also acknowledge some of the absurdities of gender performance for non-transgender people. Do you know what I mean? There are a lot of sort of, I'm thinking of tailgating rituals, these images of masculinity or cheerleading, or you know what I mean? There are a lot of very gendered activities we all perform that are sort of inherently funny or ridiculous, and of course, we should make a space for that.
Yeah, the theory person Judith Butler became famous for a lot of ideas. One of them was the idea that not all trans people necessarily, but drag queens and other people who are really non-naturalistic and out there reveal the performed and constructed nature of all gender. It doesn't mean gender is not real, it means it's all performed. One more sentence, because I think it's important to acknowledge this before we move on. There is a polarity in these representations that we're thinking of. On one pole is the awesome Rabelaisian carnivalesque, let's show that we can have fun with representations of gender and we can try to be as many people as we can be and be who we are, and that's great. And I think that's what you were asking about. It is important to acknowledge, as we talk about artistic creation and the carnivalesque and irony and frivolity, that a lot of people are still actually being fired or hurt or killed for being who they are. And there is a background of real harm that we all need to think about how to prevent. That is far in the background or close to the surface of a lot of the comedy and the irony in trans self-representation. And I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Yeah, can I make one point?
Yeah.
In addition to what you just said? Don, I finally found a way around to answering your question. I think it's true there's a wide range of representations of the carnivalesque associated with trans, but what I find troubling or difficult to deal with as a trans person engaging with some types of art that do that is that too often the trans elements are not part of a person's experience, but they are merely a trope for Babel, or they're a trope for the decline of civilization. They're the butt of the joke. They're the trans person head first in the trash can. And I think that's a conversation that it's important to have, and I would love to have. But I think that there's this whole question of, is that a person's experience, or is it a trope for some kind of Frankfurt School thing that hasn't been quite worked out yet with regard to sexuality?
Can we have another question? Martin will bring you your microphone.
Hello, thank you all for your very wonderful thoughts this afternoon. My question, because previously you talked about comedy and tragedy, and I am very interested in ways in which there are pressure on trans stories to either be happy and joyful or to be tragic, and ways in which the outside world edits them or rejects stories. I recently was part of a group of a panel of judges in which one of the judges who rejected a trans book for an honor because he thought it didn't have enough joy in it. It was too depressing. And I mean, I think the opposite does take place, but I think that is, I would be really interested in your thoughts about those conversations about, there is the idea of a tragic story that has been attached to many different queer narratives, but also what about the pressure to perform and put a smile on?
Right. I mean, I think that's a great question. I sort of wanted to hook it up to what we were talking about before. I think it's really important to look at having written one book about history, and I think that I'm a sort of historian, but when looking at things in a larger historical context, right, that in fact, we actually read Will of Loneliness very differently now. We read it now about a story about bravery versus how they read it back in 1921 or 1919, I forget the publisher date. You know, and these things change time by time. We actually can look at like great drag queens from the 50s and 60s, like Charles Pierce, who really does do this magnificent job of exploding gender with his shows. And I want to say, just the person who said before that, in fact, I think the ability to do satire and to do parody shows both sort of ownership as well as a marginalized place that you actually have to do it in order to like assert yourself. But I think it's also important to like remember that when we look at second wave feminism, pre-Judith Butler and pre the notion of gender performance, right? When we look at second wave feminism, the early feminists, Robin Morgan, Shulamith Firestone, other people, they hated drag queens. They really started nothing more as a mean-spirited, horrible parody of what women had to endure. When you would say this to a young feminist today, she would say, or he would say, that makes no sense. That's just crazy. What about performance, you know? So when we're talking about all of this, when we're really talking about this sort of history, we really have to put it in the very secure historical context that these things happen and how we read it now. I think people having read Myra Breckinridge when it came out, it was really different than when I read it 2 years ago.
Susan Stryker hates it, or at least did hate it. This is in transgender history. It's mentioned as in Susan Stryker's book, Transgender History, Myra Breckinridge is sort of kicked out of the potential canon of trans writing. Stryker says, this is not for real. This is a certain kind of 70s gay man's parody of this experience. And this, this may be generational. There's a question, there's another question. Yeah.
I think this discussion is really valuable of the questioning of the gender binary, but as a young trans woman and mother who identifies very much as female, though, and wishes to pass, I think that perspective is also important to bring into the conversation, and that's also a form of trans art, questioning that being a woman does not necessarily isn't necessarily tied to a certain appearance, and that doesn't make me part male, part female. I can be entirely female, or a trans woman who feels that her gender is female, is validly a woman. So I think that is also, just as I think we all should challenge the gender binary, putting us all in the in-between space is also a form of oppression, I feel. So I think that's an important point that I think should be mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah. That wasn't phrased as a question, but it gives rise to important questions. Does anyone else, Kat, do you want to talk about passing and not passing, or including various kinds of performance?
Get back to me on that one.
We will. I think that Trace had more.
I just wanted to respond to your really wonderful comment. I sympathize with what you're talking about, and these are issues that it's kind of funny. I mean, there are so many different positions, and they are not all collapsible into one. And I think it's like we have to agree to disagree on some points. And I think that's great. I mean, one of the things, my mentor, Carrie Edwards, who was a poet, she was in her own life, it was very important to her that she be recognized as a woman and completely, and seen as such by her other people in her life. But at the same time, her ideas in her poems were all about no gender, about demolishing gender, getting rid of the regime of gender. This is kind of this utopian thing at the end of time that we would get rid of gender eventually, and when the revolution happens, which, you know, maybe it's just about to happen, we don't know. But that there's sometimes a distinction between the intellectual content of trans art, which might be against gender, and the person's life, who the person who might be living a life that is very much wanting to be recognized completely as a woman or completely as a man, or have other kinds of roles like mother, father.
And you can be one thing in your life and another thing, or many other things in your art. I mean,
yes.
that's the question we started with, I think, is the division between life and art. And one of the great things about not espousing or not holding fast to that binary in art is that leaves you liberated to claim whatever identity feels right to you in life. You know, it's a space for play or experimentation, I think.
Yeah. Sarah, can we get one more question in? A quick one? Quick answers, yeah.
I'm formulating this question as I say it, but it's wonderful to be at a fine institution like Harvard and have this kind of panel. I wonder if you foresee in the future more universities creating trans art studies, as we have in the past to deal with the issue of African American. They initially called it Black Studies departments, Holocaust studies, women's studies, to sensitize the intellectual community to the broadest questions, whether they be fine arts representation, poetry. I mean, do you see that as something that we can invite into the intellectual community to have these broad conversations, and to be able to, even in the question in terms of like La Cage aux Folles, the stereotyping, but seeing that as an art and not viewing it as stereotypes of people. And I just wondered your thoughts on that in terms of future broadening our perspectives.
The future of trans art or trans studies in one sentence per panelist. No? No? Michael says I should start with
over there, yeah.
with Kat.
Oh boy. So I, as an undergrad, having been only at one university, don't think that I can speak on its being able to spread to other places. But I can say that even since I've been here, you know, for 2.5 years, I've seen a huge growth in sort of the awareness of trans art on Harvard's campus. There, you know, from theater shows to panels like this to the sorts of things that make their way into writing workshops and courses on, you know, creative writing in the Women and Gender Studies department here. It definitely seems to be sort of building or gaining mass, and I'm hoping that I get to see that continue.
Right. Speaking, so I want to preface this by saying, speaking as somebody who's actually made an entire career out of being a publicly identified homosexual, doing gay rights work and gay rights writing, and actually being in the beginning of gay and lesbian studies and queer studies as a discipline, and having seen all these other disciplines, going to college when African American studies became a thing, and just I'm working on a new book about hate, and my friend Kay told me there's actually a discipline in many colleges now called hate studies. I would hope to see, I understand all of these happen because people need voices, and people need, within a university or college, you actually need a discipline to have that voice, and that's how it functions. My hope would be that we would actually, in some maybe utopian way at the end of the world or something, be able to move beyond that we would not actually need a gay and lesbian studies discipline, we would actually not need a hate discipline, a trans discipline. But rather, there's no reason why we couldn't, I hate to keep on harping on Samuel Richardson, but teach all those other novels in English courses as trans novels without, because the reality is that Harvard, not a surprise, has a lot of money, and it's very progressive in many ways, and it's able to do this. Many, many other schools, and I teach at Dartmouth part-time, Dartmouth has a lot of money, it's not as progressive. These are not going to happen, and I would rather see us move to really sort of an integrationist mode in which all these topics were in pre-existing disciplines, and then get rid of all of those disciplines too and turn it into some sort of larger humanities conundrum, conglomeration, amalgamation.
I think I couldn't agree more. That is an answer about the future of institutions, future of art and artists also. Hannah, and then Trace, and then Michael, and then we are all going to go eat some food and come back.
Okay. Future of trans art. I think that, again, I think I'm here primarily kind of representing, new media production, and, to me, that's the wave of the future. Not to be cheesy and say wave of the future, but it's true. And I think that the more people have access to more information, to each other, to the creative process, the more it will advance over time. And I think that, a lot of the ideas around studying trans individuals or people really either gets cradled in a lot of sociology classes, and it's really kind of trapped in women's studies, I suppose, which I think isn't always the correct place for it to be, and I think that it could, go beyond, those general locations, I think, for academic research.
Do not forget, by the way, how many of us have been waiting for years and years to see Kate Bornstein's theater performance in addition to reading her books. I want to be sure we can be back at 7:30 to see your work and to see her work. And so I'm going to ask for brief statements, brief answers from Trace and from Michael.
Okay, what I was just going to say fled my mind. The question was the future. Okay.
Easy peasy.
I think just in terms of the relationship between being read and being unreadable, I think the concept of trans has been pretty unreadable in a lot of ways, and it's becoming more readable, especially in relation to artwork. And I've seen that change dramatically within my lifetime, and I can only hope that that continues to happen, and that and part of that readability is institutional structures like, say, let's have some more jobs in transgender studies. Let's have more. I don't know what the issues are between queer studies and transgender studies, but can't we get over them and try to integrate some of this stuff together? And I mean, does my putting trans in front of my work that I'm doing as a scholar make it harder for me to access queer studies milieu? Does it make it harder for me to access a regular literature milieu? I just hope there are more opportunities for all of us working in this field.
By the way, I was just trying to stall for time when I made Kat answer first. I didn't expect to have the last word. So I've written down a couple things. I hope it will be that they will apply to not only the discipline of trans studies, but also trans arts. I think it's really important that in institutions of higher learning, and if possible, in the broader community, that we try to encourage our citizenry to show a few different characteristics. I think we need to be critical about rhetorics that limit us or limit definitions of what persons are or how art can be made or be good art. I think we need to be compassionate about misunderstandings and people who don't share our experience. I think we need to be curious about differences between people. I think we need to be engaged in terms of fighting for people's rights and recognizing our own privilege and how that informs our ability to be here talking about this today with these wonderful people. And I think we need to be, lastly, open-minded about indeterminacy and about our inability sometimes to tell what someone originally was or what they're going for, and to try to embrace what's being offered and participate in an open-minded dialogue.
Thanks so much. See you right back here in an hour.